Welcome to today's Spark Your Health Talk, Living Well with Stress and Trauma with Dr. Gabor Maté, Dr. Alyssa Eppel, and Dr. Daniel Siegel. My name is Katira Noviello-Kapoor, and I am the Senior Director of Health Promotion, Wellness, and Athletics at the 92nd Street Y. We are thrilled to welcome these renowned speakers to our virtual stage as we explore an awakening and evolution in human culture and consciousness, starting within ourselves. I would like to thank our generous sponsors for this event, 1440 Multiversity and Compassionate Inquiry. Thank you for the support in making this important conversation a virtual program that is accessible to all. I encourage all of you to look to the chat during our program to learn more about these wonderful organizations. We hope you will also be able to join us for these upcoming Spark Your Health talks. On Monday, March 6th, 92NY welcomes back Dr. Nancy Lonsdorf to talk about pumping up your cognitive strength. And to continue deepening your understanding of stress reduction, join us on March 14th when we welcome Dr. Pooja Lakshman and Lauren Smith-Brody to discover a revolutionary real self-care framework. We will leave 20 minutes at the end of our program for questions, which will be collected from the chat. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the duration of the program. I am now pleased to introduce our moderator and fellow speaker this evening, Dr. Alyssa Eppel. Dr. Alyssa Eppel is a professor and vice chair in the Department of Psychiatry at University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Eppel also leads a mental health council as part of the UC-wide Center for Climate, Health, and Equity. She wrote the New York Times bestseller, The Telomere Effect, with Nobel laureate Elizabeth Blackburn on stress and aging, and her newest book, The Stress Prescription, focuses on science-based fundamental practices to increase well-being. Dr. Eppel, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Katera. Thank you for bringing us together to talk about this incredibly important topic, how to live well with stress and trauma in this world today. And I'm just so pleased to be here with my two colleagues, Gabor Maté and Dan Siegel, who have very innovative and integrative insights on why we are so stressed at this moment. We are in a peak moment of human suffering, and we all sense this. We're all here together to be exploring how can we live our best life? What does this mean for us as individuals, as a society? We can just think of the news this week and what we've been exposed to. We're numb to it, we're used to it, but it's horrific. We have the war in Ukraine. We have the earthquake in Turkey. We have the day of hate that we just experienced, anti-Semitic violence. We have police racial violence. And we have our personal and our own emotional struggles that are inevitable being a human. And so we have these layered dimensions of adversity. I've been studying stress for 30 years, how it gets under the skin, how it affects aging in the body. And one of the most important aspects of being a human and having this human body and being able to live well with stress is a deep understanding of what stress is and how we can best live with it. So I am so pleased to have this discussion, not just about core root causes of our suffering, but also the tremendous hope of living in this moment, of being a human who has such insight and knowledge, and our actions matter so much for our future generations. So let me introduce my two colleagues here, Dan Siegel, who's the executive director of the Mindsight Institute. He's a household name in many countries for his work on helping us understand how the brain works, the social mammal brain, interpersonal neurobiology, attachment, parenting. He just wrote, after 20 bestsellers, he wrote his magnum opus, Intraconnected, Me plus We as the integration of self, identity, and belonging, which really explains some of our causes of misery, our narrative of the solo self. Dan is going to help us understand how we can wake up from this lie of the separate self. And Gabor Maté, physician, best-selling author. He has brought us so much insight over decades on understanding addiction, trauma, child development. Gabor has struck a deep chord of resonance across the world with his views about trauma. He's also just shared with the world his magnum opus, The Myth of Normal. And he points out how we can live with unrecognized trauma and hidden daily stress. And he's creating a paradigm shift in how we view and understand trauma. So we have these human bodies that have these sensitized stress response systems, and it's really not easy to walk around as a human these days. And we often cut off from our body, just kind of try to live in our head. And whereas part of the whole answer and solution is not viewing negative emotions as the problem, but actually naming them, being aware of them, and listening to our body. So we'll get more into that. So I'd like to start by welcoming both of you. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Dan, why don't we start with you? So in this state of affairs that has brought us all together, can you describe to us, is part of this place of this peak of human suffering that we're in caused by our own doing, our limitations in how we understand our mind?
One way to begin this discussion, I think, is to say that when we feel overwhelmed, when something meaningful is at stake and we feel hopeless for what the future holds or helpless to do something about it, it can make that understandable stress of a meaningful thing happening to turn into distress. And in some ways, the related topic for today is about trauma, when events that are happening can overwhelm our ability to cope and lead to lasting negative impacts that both you, Alyssa, and Gabor, you have beautifully written about. And so what I'd like to just present is the view that one of the messages that modern culture has been giving that is very different from what indigenous wisdom has taught us from thousands of years of various traditions from around the world, and also paralleled by contemplative wisdom practices from thousands of years, also from around the world, is the view that modern culture says the self is the same as the individual, that who we are is just this person in a singular body or bodies like ours. If we call that the solo self, this isolated, separated view of what the self is, we go against what indigenous teachings have taught. We go against what contemplative teachings have taught, and yet we embed this in the way we parent our children, the way we school them in educational programs, the way culture at large is telling us that we're separate. What I want to suggest to you is that that mechanism of the solo self seeps into our core, into our soul, into our minds, and has us feel without even our awareness that there's something not quite right. And so it leads to social injustice and racism, saying us versus them, and we are better than those people over there. It leads to misinformation and polarization. It leads even to the climate crisis, where we separate as humans from nature as if we could possibly be not a part of all living beings. So this solo self may be a lethal lie, lethal in the sense that racism and genocide and what we're seeing now, even with this day of hate, are driven by this in-group, out-group history we've inherited. But yet we can rise above that if we realize that we can transcend this view of the separate self with awe, with gratitude, with compassion, which are usually called self-transcendent, but rather see them as self-expanding. So we're not just a me, but we're also a we, this notion of a we, and the idea that we are intra-connected within the wholeness of things. So I think the pathway forward, which we can talk about collectively, is a pathway to identify the problem, like a splinter in your foot, remove the splinter. So the limping that humanity is doing and is about to destroy the earth with, the living systems on earth, we can actually identify it, remove it, and do something about it. The solo self is that splinter that we can actually heal in a very practical way and realize the me and the we that is our true intraconnected identity.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dan. We'll want the technology for removing the splinter soon. So, Gabor, in thinking about this mental health epidemic, particularly of our youth, and how people are interpreting the world, I would love to hear how you think of trauma, the role trauma plays in our mental health crisis.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'll address that in a moment. Let me just first register my pleasure in being on line with the two of you. I happen to have two good books in my possession here. One's called The Stress Prescription by Elisa, and the other is Dan's wonderful Interconnected. These books are never far from my reach. I'm also unique in this crew because I'm the only one who's interviewed the other two for his own book. So both of you are in my book, The Myth of Normal, and deservedly so, because you've both contributed so much to my own understanding of things. And it's quite remarkable that all three of us have come up with books within a few months of each other, except in the case of Dan, because he writes a book every 2 weeks. So it's not hard to coincide with him.
Yeah.
Let me address one more issue here. This just happened today. Pope Francis, 3 days ago, I should say 2 weeks ago, put out a tweet. And he said, social justice demands that we fight against the causes of poverty, inequality, and the lack of labor, land, and lodging, against those who deny social and labor rights, and against a culture that leads to taking away the dignity of others. This is Pope Francis, a very famous Canadian psychologist who I'll not dignify by mentioning by name here, but you would know of him, many of you. He tweeted back, "There's nothing Christian about social justice. Redemptive salvation is a matter of the individual soul."
Wow.
Now, here's a psychologist who understands nothing about human beings whatsoever. Because to answer your question, Alyssa, about the mental health epidemic that is striking the Western world, the New York Times 2 days ago had an article about the rise in childhood in youth depression and anxiety. There have been articles in the New Yorker, the New York Times in the last 6 months, hand-wringing over what's driving the epidemic of childhood suicides. The number of children being diagnosed and treated with medicated for X number of so-called mental health disorders is burgeoning. There was an article in the New York Times on the front page only 3 or 4 months ago that talked about the same issue, and they featured a teenager, 17-year-old, I think, who's on 8 different psychiatric medications. 8 psychiatric medications. So there's something going on that the culture both causes on the one hand and doesn't want to recognize on the other, which is that individual mental health, and this is very much along the lines of what Dan was speaking about, individual mental health is not separable from the environment. And it's not separable from the relationships or the lack of relationships that people experience in their lives. So that because our neurobiology is communal and interpersonal, it also means that even if you point to some biological process in a human's brain that you think is causing the mental health condition, what you're missing is that biology itself reflects that person's relationship with the world and with the culture. And driving the mental health epidemic amongst youth in our society today is precisely the nature of connections, which are very often stressed, troubled, and trauma inflicted, and which are also very often isolating and isolated. So that whatever happens to an individual reflects what's happening to their whole environment and to their culture. And the New York Times and its writers and anybody else will never discover the source of the mental health crisis that many people are facing, particularly young people are facing, without looking at the larger questions of what is it about a culture that stresses parents so much that they can't be available for the children the way they would want to be? What is it that uh, dictates that so many people should carry trauma without even knowing it because their healthcare givers learn nothing about trauma during their training? What is it that isolates people so much? How come in the face of the social media, what we actually have is not a social media? It doesn't make us more social. It makes us more isolated and alone. And it's been shown that the more people spend time on social media, the less healthy their mental status happens to be. In this culture of competition and isolation and individualism, which is not the same, by the way, as individuality, because true individuality has to do with connection with others. Individualism isolates you from others. Unless we're looking at these larger issues, unless we're looking at the root causes, we'll never understand the fruit that we're reaping these days. And that fruit is increasing mental health crisis amongst our youth. So thank you. Those are my preliminary remarks.
Thank you, Gabor. The science of social connection and health undergirds this, and for everything that you have described about our interconnected health, it is there are data points, and they basically show that our health moves together. Our health, based on our zip code, we know our health, we know our mortality rate based on our social demographics. I could determine your help, try to predict your nervous system arousal based on your marital quality and mood of your partner. So there's this dynamic covariance between our nervous systems, our cortisol, our mood. And so in every moment, we are shaping each other's well-being in the best case, or feelings of stress and threat. And so that is just one of the many ways of how we are so deeply biologically interconnected. Even though we see the end of our skin, of our physical body, our mind is extended, our mind is outside of our body. It's creating meaning and interpreting the world based on what's between us, relationships based on what we see in our environment, based on what we think of as stress triggers that we're so used to we might not be aware of. Even just the phone is creating more cognitive load. And then there are safety signals, which are other supportive people or nature. And just knowing that is power. We can shape our environment and our connections toward love, safety. Dan.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Alyssa. And I know in this short time the three of us have with everyone, I think we can focus on, not only these principles that may be the root causes of the distress people feel and the trauma people are experiencing, but also some possible practical steps for moving towards healing the traumas, to resolving traumas, to really reducing stress, and in some ways transforming stress. So I want to also, like Gabor, put a pitch out for your book, The Stress Prescription, because that book really gives people this wonderful set of useful tools to actually not only understand stress, but actually do something about it. So I hope you'll bring up some things about that. In terms of what I presented initially, that the possible underlying root cause for many of these things, including the very painful and important new ways that Gabor has pointed out, we have this epidemic of anxiety, depression, addiction, and suicide in our youth, not to mention in our adult population, that the separation, this disconnection people feel, in many ways stems from a modern culture that expresses itself through how we parent, through how we bring kids up in schools, how we operate in corporations, in companies, how the government operates. And in modern culture, it's giving us this statement: the self is the individual, that there's a solo self. So the pathway forward, I think, is to identify that this way that we limit the perspective of what the self is actually killing us. It's actually, I think, as a psychiatrist, I can say this from both a clinical practice point of view, but also as a researcher studying relationships, that disconnection is a dysfunction in how the mind has been presented to us. So that if we then imagine then an identity lens, and you can do it even right now as a simple practice, take a look at your thumb in front of your face and move that thumb around. That thumb has a sensation, a perspective, and an agency. The three elements, what we scientifically think of as self. Sensation is the S, P is perspective, A is the agency. That thumb has a sensation to it. And then if you move all your fingers around, you can feel, wow, that can extend out beyond just my thumb to my whole hand. And now move your whole arm around. And now let it have your whole body move around. Try this, everyone listening. And what you can feel then is, wow, I have sensation, perspective, agency that here is in this skin encased body. But now imagine with all the thousands of people listening here in the present moment to these conversations we're having right now, that you can reach out, like the phone call we're hearing coming through somewhere.
Gabor's calling in.
That we can allow ourselves to reach out to people who are actually physically not here with us now. We can allow ourselves to not only move to people we may know who are not physically near us, but widen that identity lens to include all of the human family, all 8 billion of us. And now imagine that the sensation, perspective, and agency is not just about being human, but is about the living, breathing biosphere of animals, plants, fungi, all of us deeply intra-connected, this connectedness within the whole, so that you realize I have an identity lens. So this is, to get practical, that we can develop and name a lens through which we can, like a camera, be narrow in and say, I have a body, that's a me, but I have these relationships with other human beings, some I know, some I don't know, and with all living beings, that's the we. And you go the me and the we, when they're together, it's we. You integrate them where you're honoring differences and promoting linkages. So if we started doing this at home as parents with our children, in schools, with teachers, and with young people, with adolescents, in corporations, we're having a big meeting even next week to explore how can companies and governments start to live with this interconnected lens. I think we can do what Joanna Macy has always asked us to do, the activist who's for decades has been asking, how do we help cultivate the great turning, a turning toward a new way of living? And I think this is the splinter that we can remove, that is the false view of the self being the same as the individual, and realize we have an identity lens. And we tried a little teeny practice here, and we can teach each other that we are both within, inside these bodies, and we are between. We are the me and the we. We are we. And that is a way we can go forward.
It's such a beautiful, I'm going to call it model, but I'll say depiction of reality. But we can't see it well. And it takes experiencing connection in different ways. So, Dan, how did we get there? Gabor also talks about becoming whole beyond just the self and being authentic. And so intellectually, we can understand our interdependence, our interconnection, and how we influence each other. But if we're stuck in this individualistic model that we're really quite wedded to through our cultural upbringing, what experiences will help us understand and feel and live this shift, this paradigm shift toward this intra-connected society that we all know we need and is there, but we're ignoring the connection. So you and Gabor have used, maybe there are different words that we either don't use and need to use more or need to make up to help us see in this way, besides the word interdependence. And so I'm open to hearing how each of you think about this. Gabor, you talk a lot about wholeness. Dan, you talk about mui as a way to understand self, other, and the connectedness. And how can we have words that describe this human experience that is there, but we're missing, and we're feeling alone and isolated and separate?
Well, I'm from Hungary, and my mother tongue is Hungarian, and it's very interesting because the Hungarian word for health literally means wholeness. It's not that you need to learn Hungarian, all of you, but the word is egészség. Egész means whole, and shég means ness. So literally, the word for health is wholeness. Most people that use the word don't even realize that that's the origin of it, but it's clearly that's what it means. Now, in English as well, the origin of the word health comes from an Anglo-Saxon word for wholeness. So there's something about the understanding of people way back then who created language, who knew that health meant wholeness. So then the question of regaining wholeness is itself a question that already denotes some kind of a loss, that some of you've lost that wholeness. Now, from that perspective, for me, that happens precisely when in childhood, the nurturing environment is not able to see the wholeness of the child and is not able to provide the child with the connections where the mui in dance terms is actually embodied. So that ill health itself, and I make the case for physical illness, from autoimmune disease to malignancy in many, many cases, or I would say in most cases, certainly in what we call mental illness, it all originates in this loss of connection. So then the question of health and restoration of health has to do with how to regain the connection. Well, one thing is, in this culture, how much attention do we pay to our bodies? How connected are we to our body? So many of us live from the neck up, and we think that reality is what we think or what other people think, or very often what other people think of us. So literally, it's like we're living in the minds of other people rather than in our own bodies. So I won't say more here, I'll say more later, but the very beginning of wholeness is just connect to your body. Feel it.
Absolutely.
When you're, and Alyssa, in your work, you talk about how connections and relationships actually affect the very functioning of our chromosomes.
Right.
And all this is happening not just on the gross body level, but even on the level of the most minutest processes in our bodies that we can't possibly even directly feel. Well, let's at least pay attention to what we can feel. Even as you're sitting here listening to the three of us, what's going on in your body? Are you even aware of it? Or are you too caught up in listening to the words?
I will take your invitation. I always start with the hands. Like, how much tension are we holding right now that we're not even aware of? Can you just relax the tension in your hands and be open to this moment, to what you can receive, what is emerging? One way that I view all of this is that so much of our attention is taken up by our over-exaggerated, beautiful threat response, right? It saves us. It saved our hide many times, our ancestors, and that's why we're here. We're so good at detecting threat and lack of safety. And boy, has that been a perfect storm of, I will say through the generations, but exactly right now, of developing an exaggerated and unhelpful threat response. We all are born with different calibrations of our threat response from our intergenerational trauma, our stress-related epigenetics, and then we have our early experiences, which have long shadows, which can shape our sensitivity. But in this moment, we all have a level of threat, I will say most of us, that we don't need to be carrying around when nothing is happening, when we can really be relaxing. So true relaxation is very rare. We can actually become aware of our our emotions in our body. So starting with these check-ins in our body. So I think we all agree how important, how much information there is in the body, the nervous system that's in the body. And just some strategies that are in the stress prescription really are, they start with just recognizing how we're focused on uncertainty, the stress of uncertainty and vigilance and lack of safety, and how we need to remind ourselves, we need explicit safety signals to say, right now, I am safe, and I can actually let go of some of the unconscious stress I'm holding in my body. Also control, holding on to control. We all have situations we wish were different, and we spend a lot of both mental and unconscious energy trying to control things. And then another way that I think we devalue, for some reason we don't think it's as valuable as more mental or top-down ways of managing stress, is metabolizing the stress in our body, because boy, do we create a lot of stress arousal in our nervous system and our hormonal system. Our telomeres are responding to that level of stress. And so recognizing that we are that we are animals, and that we actually need to be working stress through our body. And that can be positive stress, hormetic stress, hot and cold exposure, exercise, walking, movement. All of those are ways that we can help ourselves balance in each day in these moments. So I'll stop there. But I do think this ability to connect in the way you have both described starts from within, and that ability to be aware of our emotions and balance. And Gabor, I've heard you talk about being your authentic self is partly that emotional awareness.
Dan, did you want to say something here?
No, go ahead, Gabor.
Okay. So when it comes to stress, the word stress itself was coined by another Hungarian, actually, János Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, or better known as Hans Selye by his German name, because his father was Hungarian, his mother was Austrian. And so Selye was a medical doctor who came to Canada and did the research on stress in the laboratory. And he's the one that showed that under stress, animals in the laboratory will have hypertrophied or overgrown adrenal glands, shrunken immune organs, and ulcerations in their intestines. And Selye was not only a scientist and a physician, he was also a kind of a Renaissance humanist. And he said that the biggest stresses in modern life are emotional ones, and the biggest stress of all is trying to be who you're not, trying to be somebody else other than who you are. I'm paraphrasing him, but that's what he said. Now, in our society, all too often, children are put in this situation where they have to choose on the unconscious level: am I going to be authentic, feel my feelings, feel all my emotions, and be true to myself, or will I belong and be accepted by my environment? And ideally, both are possible. A bear cub doesn't have to decide, shall I be an authentic bear cub, or shall I belong to my mother? But human beings are thrust into that situation all the time, because parents in this society are constantly told that certain emotions on their children are not acceptable. So children then have this tragic decision to make on the unconscious level: will I be myself, connected to myself, or will I be accepted? And that's not a choice at all, because the child cannot live if they're not held in some kind of an attachment relationship. So this battle of authenticity versus attachment gets resolved in the favor of attachment all the time. Then you go into society and you keep doing it. You keep trying to get accepted rather than being true to yourself. That's a major source of stress. So in terms of advice, practical advice, notice all the times that you're trying to please rather than to be yourself. Notice all the time that you deny your emotions and your preferences for the sake of being accepted. And ask yourself, am I still that child that is so dependent that I have to keep abandoning myself in order to be accepted? Ask yourself every day, where today did I not assert who I was? For this, don't do that. Now, I teach this course called Compassion Inquiry. Don't do it in a self-accusatory way, in a self-shaming way. Why didn't I do this? But ask yourself, huh, I noticed I wasn't true to myself. What was I afraid of? And you realize that what you're afraid of is something that was genuinely fearful to you as a child, but no longer has to be. You can actually make a decision not to be authentic, no matter what somebody else may think of it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. If I can build on that, Alyssa, and this should really connect to what both of you are saying. The stress of feeling like you cannot be from the inside true to what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what your whole system is experiencing, and then have to conform, because we are, as you point out, Alyssa, social creatures, is profoundly distressing, right?
Yeah.
And so part of the way I think forward in terms of practically what can we take from this conversation the three of us are having, there's a concept known as integration, which has the two components of differentiation on the one hand. So Gabor, you're saying, listen, you need to differentiate first to be not individualistic, but to be an individual. And then in the journey of having that authentic connection, you're able to reach out and then do the linkage part of integration. And Alyssa, when I've read your powerful work in its various forms, the scientific papers and the public books, which are so wonderful, for me, part of the way of, in the telomere effect, for example, optimizing telomerase, or in the stress prescription, these mechanisms are all about promoting integration. So the take-home message for me of our conversation is that if we can offer in these challenging times, which are challenging for many, many, many reasons, but one is that we're now at the third anniversary of COVID-19 pandemic on Earth. The disconnection that we've experienced, the distress that's arising, is because of impaired integration. So the journey forward, that splinter we're talking about, is to realize what is going on that is impairing this combination of differentiation on the one hand and linkage on the other. So one idea is that culture is telling us who we are is just separate. So it's emphasizing excessive differentiation. And on the other hand, we have the processes, Gabor, that you were talking about social media, or Alyssa, what you were talking about this day of hate, where there's this incredible force of polarization and misinformation that says this in-group is good. And so if you want to belong to us, come to this extreme. And linkage then is requiring a loss of honoring your differentiated nature. So what results when integration is impaired is chaos and rigidity. And what we're seeing in our human family is huge amounts of chaos and rigidity. And what we're seeing in the biosphere is huge amounts of chaos and rigidity, because human beings have excessively differentiated ourselves from nature. And what's happening there then is that we are producing a situation where we treat Earth like a trash can instead of like our home or an extension of our bodies, the body of the biosphere. So in medicine, when there is a cell that stops knowing that it's a part of a larger system, we call it cancer.
Yeah.
And the cancer of the psyche, of the human mind in modern times, is this view of the self as separate. We can do something about this because it's a constructed experience. And so what I hope this conversation can do, that we're all having, all of us listening now, is we have something that's called pervasive leadership. everyone listening can go out and learn to take your individual body, work with the stress to reduce it in all these ways to develop more resilience, to take the traumas that we're experiencing and learn how to identify them. And so we can then bring ourselves into a state of healing and wholeness. And then, as we do that, gather these basic emotions, if you think about it, of awe, which expands the self, gratitude expands the self, compassion expands the self, and realize that it's not getting rid of the self, it's realizing we're in this together. And, with these practical steps, I think we can take Joanna Macy, who's just about to turn 94, and take her request that humanity consider the Great Turning as the path forward and say, these are some practical steps where we can do that. We can turn toward each other and realize the interconnected nature of whom we really are.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. I will just add, my personal struggle informed by science and research, looking toward understanding how we can live well with existential stress and what brings joy and awe. And I'm so glad, Dan, you talked about the transformative emotions of awe, wonder, compassion. And it's really hard to be positive about the future, given we know we have hard times ahead with the climate crisis, worse times, and including not feeling efficacious just as just one person. What can I really do in my short time here? And so it has been very powerful, as in addition to the trying to manage stress and symptoms and what we do to regulate, to from that state of actually just letting ourselves be okay and reminding ourselves it's okay to relax and be in this body that we were given. So this could be through breathing, through meditation, through a practice like Gabor was talking about, just asking, where is my authenticity? Am I being true to myself? Connecting in that way allows us to look out to see the sacredness of the day, the beauty in front of us. So I'm going to add a question to that, which is to asking, am I being true to myself? And the question is simply, what is right now in my life and in the world? And so flipping the glass to half full, using gratitude to remind ourselves what a miracle it is to be able to be alive, to be able to see the good and the beauty. And that joy in the moment is incredibly important for everything, for stress management, for feeling connected with others, and for all of those transformative emotions, Dan. Of course, being in nature helps a lot, but I feel like we've lost rituals and practices, and so we don't have the fabric that helps us see the beauty that is in front of us and the joy and be part of the Great Turning in our way, right? We won't know the outcome. We certainly don't know the long-term outcome, but in our local actions to do things that matter to us and to other people, that's what we can do.
I have a somewhat different attitude towards gratitude. That's a poem, Attitude Towards Gratitude. I've never been able to talk myself into gratitude, ever. Sometimes, and I noticed I used to speak about it. People say, well, how's life? And I'd say, I have a lot to be grateful for. But that doesn't mean that I'm grateful. It just means I have a lot of reasons to be grateful. But reasons could never make me grateful. And it doesn't matter how successful or how satisfying this or that aspect of my life might have been. I could never talk myself into gratitude. Now, if you can, more power to you. But I can't. What I do notice, however, is that the older I get, the more gratitude becomes a natural quality of mine. I wouldn't say that it's always present, but it just seems to be more spontaneously present than it ever used to be. And there's a question here in the chat line. How important is neuroplasticity in the context of healing from trauma, strengthening, training new neuron pathways? In other words, Dan is the brain researcher here, but neuroplasticity is our capacity to develop new circuits. And I actually think that gratitude is one of these circuits, that it's either online or it isn't. Now, neuroplasticity, fortunately, as long as we're conscious and mentally with it, is, I think, it's a potential for all of our lives. Doesn't Even as we lose neurons, I think we can gain new connections. And this is a kind of a joke I've often made, but it's also the truth. I just turned 79, and I wouldn't want to be as young and stupid as I was when I was 78. Because so so if people are asking, is change and transformation possible? Yes, and that's why I think gratitude is more present with me these days. For me,
That's so beautiful. I'm so grateful for the work that both of you do and the impact that we know it's had on so many people, including me. So we do have we are taking questions for our last 15 minutes. So feel free to type in questions, and as we're feeling, as we've shifted to thinking about what makes us happy and gratitude, it is contagious. It's a contagious emotion. So I'm just going to suggest, there are many of you together in this chat, to write down something small or large that has brought you joy today. And while you're writing that, I will read the next question. How do we start a language that allows people to understand their actions have this larger pervasive effect, not just on themselves? We can do small things that matter. I love this question. Thank you, whoever wrote this, because this is, again, part of the paradigm of our limited thinking and our linear brain, and not being able to see beyond our perception and these models that we've been acculturated to. But there are models that are based in physics, like social quantum change, that really explain and show, both with data and theory, that we are much more influential than we think, that our actions have ripple effects, and especially powerful actions toward making others happy. That happiness is one of the most contagious emotions. Small acts, large acts. So I'm going to throw that to my colleagues here. What is a language that we can develop to create this, a sticky, contagious way of thinking about our influence, positive influence?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and it actually relates to another question that's here right next to it, that says, how can we reach neighbors? And I'll try to apply this in a practical way to this question. How can we reach neighbors, friends, or clients who aren't articulate, or indeed may have unpleasant or unskilled personalities, but nevertheless are fellow suffering humans?
Mm-hmm.
So that combines beautifully with actually these other two questions. There's a practice that I do every day called the Wheel of Awareness. And in the wheel, you have the center hub of awareness and the outer rim of what you're aware of, and you can do the practice. But in terms of this question of how to work with people who may be difficult or disconnected, and in many ways it connects to the next question about frozen emotions that may be suppressed. When we think about awareness kind of like a container, if our container is like the size of a very small cup, like an espresso size cup, and a stressor comes, that's the metaphor, let's say, of a tablespoon of salt, and you stick it in the little cup of water, you get overwhelmed. So your emotions can become frozen, or in terms of your neighbors, you can see them through a lens of, oh, I don't know if I can tolerate them. But when you expand that cup of awareness, like in the Wheel of Awareness practice, you're cultivating your ability to rest in that hub of the wheel, pure awareness. There's a lot of reasons to believe that that actually expands the container of consciousness, so that now imagine it being 100 gallons in size. You now take the stressor, or the neighbor you can't understand, or the emotions that you can't feel, but now those stressors are like a tablespoon of salt. You put them in 100 gallons, you mix it up, the water is perfectly drinkable. So in terms of a practice and a language, when you reach into this hub of the wheel in the metaphor, but this, what I call the plane of possibility, you start feeling, as so many people who've done the practice do, that there's the fabric of love is a fundamental aspect of the tapestry of life. And when you bring love to those emotions that are frozen, or you bring love to people who feel unreachable, the language of love is actually the language of the force of life. And when we widen that hub of the wheel, if you will, when we widen that container of consciousness, it isn't that you make this stuff happen. It's you let the stuff out of the way, open your container, and then you let this light and this love be the way that you live and learn. So that's a languaging that people start to feel. And when we experience it with each other, literally experiencing it inside and then experiencing it with each other, we can put words to it. But it's really more about how we come to live in this way of bringing linkage to these connections that before may have seemed too distant. So that's a kind of languaging that's available to everyone.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Gabor, did you want to comment on that or go to the next?
Yeah, I just wanted to address the issue of the frozen emotions. How
Yes.
can we start feeling all the frozen emotions that we have suppressed or numbed deep inside for years? I just add briefly to what Dan was saying. There's a reason. If you have frozen emotions, there's a reason why you froze them. It's because it was not safe to feel them, because you were alone with them and you were too small and helpless to be able to endure them. There was no holding environment where you could safely experience your body. So that the freezing, if you're going to call it freezing, was a very appropriate survival mechanism on the part of your organism. So if you want to feel the feelings, first of all, you have to put yourself in a safe environment where it won't be distressing because you'll be supported. That could be with friends or a group, or it could be with a therapist. Um, as long as the therapy is somewhat trauma informed, so I would say something like internal family systems or sensory motor psychotherapy, or my particular compassionate inquiry, um, any number of other therapies that understand trauma and know how to be with the traumatized person without trying to focus just on the behaviors or the thoughts, but bringing some safety to the whole person so that person then can unfreeze. That's the first. The second thing is, I never found it that difficult to get somebody to experience their emotions in a context where there's safety. And if you don't know what emotions you're experiencing, first of all, how do you even know that you got frozen feelings that you're not experiencing? Something in you, the very fact that you're asking the question knows means that there's an awareness there. If there was no awareness, you wouldn't be asking the question. And you can begin with what Alyssa and all three of us have talked about. You can begin with the body. You may not know what these frozen emotions are, but you know what your feet feel like on the ground, and your bum feels like on the seat, and your tongue feels like in your mouth, and whether your throat is dry or moist, or in other words, you can begin with the body again. That'll lead you back to yourself.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Gabor. We have time for one more question that all three of us will want to comment on about neuroplasticity. So we're going to end on a hopeful note. The question is, how important is neuroplasticity in the context of healing from trauma? And I just want to say a big yes, how beautiful it is that we have neuroplasticity. We are creatures of habit, but we can change our habits and we can change our neural pathways. So in all of our studies of stress and trauma, what we see is that people who have had a lot of trauma have a sensitized stress response system. And yet that only means know thyself and respect that you have a sensitive stress response system. You may view more threat than other people with the exact same situation, but you are even more plastic when we do our interventions like mindfulness retreats. you're showing even more change and improvement. There's a very dynamic wiring in our stress response systems that can be remodeled. And so when I think of daily stress, so many of us, most of us, are experiencing excessive daily stress because of these habits of mind, waking up, grabbing the phone, being in a rush. And when we can condition our brain to these experiences of whether it's positive bodily hormetic stress or deep rest states, and we do these short practices over and over, we are remodeling our ability to feel grounded, or our ability to cope with stress without the extra exaggeration. So I'll turn it to you two to comment on this. Is neuroplasticity important in healing from trauma?
Well, Gabor, you want to go?
No, I've already spoken about it.
Okay. So when you look at the studies of Martin Teicher on developmental trauma, which is abuse and neglect, or other studies of trauma, you can say, what does trauma do to the brain? So it impairs integration in the brain. And we could talk about the details, but that's the overall thing. So then you could say, well, is there some kind of intervention that actually grows more integration in the brain? And the answer is yes, a resounding yes. What are they? Well, you can call them 3-pillar practice, which means some practice which includes each of the following 3: training attention, opening awareness, and developing kindness and compassion. Attention training, opening awareness, kindness, and compassion training. So when you do those 3 pillars, you actually get a more integrated brain. You also get, and Alyssa, you helped me in the Aware book point this out, that the wheel of awareness has all 3, but you optimize telomerase levels to slow the aging process. You change the epigenetic regulators to actually decrease inflammation in the body. You improve immune function. You optimize cardiovascular function, and you reduce the stress hormone cortisol. So those are 5 physiological mechanisms of health, and you're integrating the brain. And if you look at the Smith and colleagues study in 2015, you can see that every measure of well-being, this multi-site study shows, every measure of well-being is predicted by how integrated the brain is by looking at something called the connectome, how interconnected the connectome is. You can grow a more integrated brain, I would say, and I really am so honored to be here with Alyssa and Gabor to talk about this. You can do this at any age. So the idea is it's better to start sooner than later, but it's never too late. And the idea there is then where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connection grows. So where you put your attention, how you open your awareness, how you develop kindness is how you grow more integration. And that's how you harness neuroplasticity to make long-lasting and meaningful change.
I'm so glad you heard it from Dan about the neurons firing together and wiring together. So we'll just have a short statement each before Katera comes back. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We had no idea how this would unfold. The 3 of us have never had a conversation before. Of course, as friends we have, and we didn't know what questions you would ask us. So I would say this unfolded so beautifully, and we asked lots of questions that we'll still think about, and we have lots of ideas about how to live well with love, connection, and purpose. And I'll say my closing comment is just to wake up with compassion for yourself, because it's hard to be a human with this body that collects stress in this world, and sending yourself love, and to any beings around you, pets, people, strangers.
I will conclude by, first of all, a bit of self-promotion. In 2 days, which is to say Saturday morning, I'm doing a stream online event with Prince Harry, and the conversation will be about loss and trauma and healing. And believe me, that exists on all social levels, in all strata. But that also leads me to say that it's not equally distributed. There was an article in the New York Times either this past weekend or the weekend before, I think, about how Black women giving birth in the United States have a much higher risk of dying, or their infants dying, than Caucasians. This is regardless of any economic status. So the stress of racism, which shortens telomeres and it causes inflammation in the body, those aren't just individual issues. This is where the we has to come into it with the me, because these larger issues, I just want to acknowledge we can't just address them on the individual level. So at some point, we do need to look at the larger social picture. And the more we work on ourselves, the more capable and the more empowered we are to address the social issues. But at the same time, just to work on ourselves, well, if that's what you need to do it. What I'm saying is, if we're asking on a social level what we can do, we have to really look at the larger question of how this culture divides us and what we can do to unite.
Thank you so much. And thank you for elevating the really global conversation about trauma now, the awareness raising, and the intersectionality of trauma and stress is the biggest story, by race, by class, by double marginality, by groups that we discriminate against.
Yeah. And my deepest hope for this gathering, to build on everything that has been said, is that when we consider that the inner work of expanding identity beyond what culture tells us from the separate self, it will naturally allow us to do the cultural work that needs to be done. Because culture is based on relationships. Relationships are based on how people bring their minds into connection with each other, how we communicate with each other. And the two things I'll just say is that kindness and compassion are integration made visible. And integration is the basis for wholeness and health. And we can do this. And together we will.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Dr. Maté, Dr. Eppel, and Dr. Siegel for this pioneering discussion. I saw many comments saying, I'll watch this again and again to truly grasp these powerful concepts. And thank you again to our sponsors, 1440 Multiversity and Compassionate Inquiry. Please do visit 92NY's Spark Your Health for upcoming events, such as Cognitive Strength with Dr. Nancy Lonsdorf on Monday, March 6th. And thank you again to our speakers. I hope everyone is walking away more in tune with the language of love and their authentic self. Stay well, everyone.